My father wrote to me saying, "Do not come to your mother's birthday party because the whole family does not want you there." I stayed silent for a moment before replying, "So you choose money over your daughter?" His arrogant response about becoming a multimillionaire and banning me from his new wealthy life made me smile. I simply closed my phone and ruined his entire retirement plan in an instant. My name is Madeline. I am 34 years old and working as a senior partner and forensic accountant at a major private equity firm in New York City. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives who only value money and fake social status. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 60th floor high above Manhattan, overlooking the busy streets below. My team of financial analysts and I were deep into a complex corporate acquisition deal. We were evaluating the assets of a Midwestern medical supply manufacturer. The room was quiet except for the sound of typing and the occasional flipping of thick financial reports. That is when my personal phone vibrated on the polished mahogany table. I glanced down, expecting a quick message from my assistant. Instead, the name Richard Caldwell flashed across the screen. My father. We had not spoken in several months, and even then our conversations were always limited to stiff, forced holiday greetings. I opened the message while my colleagues continued discussing revenue projections around me. The text was long and completely devoid of any parental warmth. "Madeline, do not bother showing up to your mother's 60th birthday gala this Saturday. We have decided it is best if you stay away. The whole family does not want you there. Your presence would only be a distraction and frankly a disgrace in front of our very important guests. We have elite investors flying in, and I will not have you ruining this night by reminding everyone of the troubled teenager we had to kick out of our house 16 years ago. Stay in your small apartment and leave the upper-class events to the people who actually belong there." I stared at the glowing screen. The words were clearly meant to hurt me, to make me feel small and insignificant. It was his favorite tactic. 16 years ago, when I was just 18 years old, my father threw my suitcases onto the driveway in the pouring rain. My mother, Patricia, a woman who cared only about her designer handbags and country club reputation, stood on the porch and watched without saying a single word. My crime was refusing to sign a legal document taking the blame and the massive financial debt for my older brother, Harrison. Harrison had crashed a sports car while highly intoxicated, causing thousands of dollars in property damage. My father demanded I sacrifice my own future and my clean record to protect his precious namesake. When I said no, he called me a cold-blooded, ungrateful child and told me to get off his property immediately. I spent my first 2 years of college working 3 grueling jobs. I slept on an old mattress in a damp, shared basement apartment and survived on cheap noodles while studying late into the night. My job now as a forensic accountant literally involves hunting down financial liars and exposing corporate fraud. I built my life and my career from absolute zero, utilizing that exact determination, while my parents continued to fund my brother's reckless and expensive lifestyle. Now, sitting in a plush executive chair wearing a custom-tailored suit, I felt a strange sense of absolute calm. The old Madeline would have cried. She would have called him begging for an explanation, or asking how a father could be so completely cruel just to protect his own image. But the woman I had become over the last 16 years did not cry over Richard Caldwell. I picked up my phone and typed a simple response. "So you choose your fragile pride and social image over your own daughter." I set the phone down and took a sip of my sparkling water. Less than a minute later, my screen lit up with his immediate reply. He was furious that I had not backed down or apologized. "It is not about pride, Madeline. It is about reality. You chose to abandon this family when you refused to help your brother. Now we are moving on to bigger and better things." Caldwell Medical Solutions is in the final stages of being acquired by a massive New York investment group. We are closing a $25 million deal this week. Your mother and I are entering a completely different social tier. We are hosting the executives at the birthday gala to finalize our relationship with them. I will not have a low-level corporate employee crashing our event and making us look bad. Do not contact us again until you learn some respect for the people who gave you life. I read the message twice. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked up at the team of brilliant financial experts sitting around the conference table. They were waiting for my specific direction on the current portfolio. I looked back down at the thick manila folder resting directly in front of me. The bold letters printed across the top of the highly confidential acquisition file read Caldwell Medical Solutions. My father thought he was dealing with some faceless group of wealthy Manhattan investors who were going to hand him $25 million and secure his luxurious early retirement. He thought he was banishing a struggling, unsuccessful daughter from his high society triumph. What Richard Caldwell did not know was that the massive New York investment group he was desperately trying to impress was actually my firm. And as the senior partner in charge of forensic auditing, I was the exact person holding the ultimate authority to approve or destroy his $25 million dream. My phone buzzed a second time against the polished wood of the conference table. I had just instructed my team to take a 15-minute break when the caller ID lit up. It was my mother, Patricia. I stared at the screen for a moment. Patricia never called me during business hours. In fact, she rarely called me at all unless she needed an audience to complain about her country club rivals or to brag about my younger sister. I swiped the screen and accepted the call, pressing the phone to my ear in the empty glass room. Madeline, sweetheart. Her voice flowed through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that immediately set my nerves on edge. I just saw the messages between you and your father. You know how stressed he gets when he is dealing with high-level corporate matters. He is carrying the weight of the entire family on his shoulders right now. I leaned back in my leather chair. My mother had perfected the art of playing the victim and the peacemaker simultaneously. She was the master of gaslighting, always smoothing over my father's verbal abuse by blaming it on his important business responsibilities. I am well aware of how Richard communicates, I replied, keeping my voice completely neutral. Banning me from your birthday party to protect your social image is a new low even for him. Patricia sighed heavily into the receiver, a practiced sound of maternal disappointment. Please do not be difficult, Madeline. We are hosting very wealthy investors from New York this weekend. These are elite corporate executives. We just want a peaceful, elegant evening without any unnecessary family tension. You have always been so stubborn and independent. You simply would not fit in with this crowd. I remained silent, letting her empty justifications hang in the air. I knew she had not called just to defend my father. Patricia always had a hidden agenda. Anyway, she continued, her tone shifting to something more businesslike. Since you will not be joining us to celebrate, I was hoping we could clear up some old family paperwork. It would honestly be the perfect birthday gift for me if we could just resolve this little issue before the big buyout. There it was, the real reason for the phone call. I asked her what specific paperwork she was referring to, even though I already knew exactly what she wanted. Well, your father and the lawyers are trying to finalize the company acquisition with the New York firm, she said, speaking quickly. But the buyers require all company shares to be consolidated. You still hold that silly 10% stake your grandfather left in your trust fund. It is completely useless to you since you have nothing to do with Caldwell Medical. Your father needs you to sign a relinquishment form today. Just transfer the 10% back to the family estate. Consider it your contribution to my birthday. My grandfather had been the only person in the family who saw through my parents. He knew Richard was a reckless businessman who prioritized expensive cars and country club memberships over actual company growth. Before he passed away, he placed 10% of the company shares in an irrevocable trust under my name. He told me it was my safety net because he knew my parents would eventually ruin everything else. You want me to sign over my inheritance as a birthday present? I asked, letting a trace of dark amusement enter my voice. Patricia immediately dropped her sweet facade. Her voice turned sharp and vicious. You owe this family, Madeline. We provided a roof over your head for 18 years. Your brother Harrison is going to be a senior executive under the new ownership, and your sister Stephanie is deeply involved in the transition. You are the only obstacle standing in the way of our massive payout. If you ruin this $25 million deal out of sheer jealousy, I will personally ensure you are permanently cut off from every single relative we have. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply told her I would not be signing any documents today and ended the call. I set the phone down feeling a profound sense of disgust. They were actually trying to steal my grandfather's final gift to me right before they cashed out. Before I could even process the sheer greed of her demand, a new notification chimed. It was an audio message from my younger sister Stephanie. I tapped play, leaning forward to rest my elbows on the table. Stephanie's voice echoed in the quiet conference room, loud and full of arrogant pride. "Hey, Madeline. Mom told me you are throwing a tantrum about being uninvited to the gala. Do us all a favor and just stay in your lane. This party is strictly for high net worth individuals. I just picked up my custom gown for the evening and it cost $15,000. You would probably show up in some cheap department store suit and embarrass us." She paused for a dramatic breath, making sure her next words landed with maximum impact. "Besides, you definitely do not want to cross my husband right now. Bradley is the lead broker handling these New York Sharks. He is the one who set up this $25 million acquisition for Dad. Bradley is managing the entire transition and the executives absolutely love him. Do not think you can come crying to us for a handout when we become filthy rich. We know you are just a bitter spinster jealous of my marriage and my money. Have a nice weekend alone." The audio message clicked off. I sat completely still, staring at the blank screen of my phone. A cold, highly calculated energy washed over me, replacing any lingering familial hurt. Bradley. My sister's husband was a loudmouth amateur who sold basic life insurance policies. He was not an investment banker. He was not a corporate broker. And he certainly was not handling any acquisitions for my private equity firm. My firm had zero record of any external broker named Bradley representing Caldwell Medical. The arrogance, the blatant lies, the desperate rushed attempt by my mother to steal my 10% share just days before the financial audit was supposed to conclude. My forensic accountant instincts flared to life like a siren. If Richard and Harrison were using a complete amateur like Bradley to push this deal through, and if they were this frantic to consolidate the shares without legal oversight, then the $25 million valuation was not just a mistake. It was a massive calculated lie. I reached out and grabbed the thick Caldwell Medical file, pulling it squarely in front of me. They thought I was a bitter dropout working a dead-end job. They thought they could bully me into giving up my grandfather's trust fund to fuel their glamorous suburban fantasy. I cracked open the cover of their internal financial reports. It was time to dissect their perfect company piece by piece. I spread the glossy financial reports across the sleek glass table. The cover page of the pitch deck boasted a $25 million valuation for Caldwell Medical Solutions. It featured high-resolution photos of my father Richard standing proudly in front of a modern manufacturing facility and my brother Harrison pointing at a chart that seemingly went straight up. To an untrained eye, it looked like the ultimate American success story. A family legacy ready to be acquired by a prestigious New York private equity firm. But I was not an untrained eye. I was a forensic accountant who hunted corporate criminals for a living. I bypassed the colorful marketing materials and went straight for the raw data. I pulled up the securely encrypted due diligence files on my laptop, accessing their federal tax returns, bank statements, and vendor invoices. Numbers do not care about social status or custom-made gowns. Numbers only tell the cold, hard truth. I started with their EBITDA earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It is the metric every buyer uses to determine if a company is actually making money. Richard claimed a solid profit margin for the last 5 quarters. But within 10 minutes of cross-referencing their accounts receivable with their actual bank deposits, I found the first glaring anomaly. There were massive revenue entries logged from international distributors. Millions of dollars supposedly flowing in from medical supply contracts in Europe and Asia. I tapped a few keys querying the federal tax identification numbers of these so-called distributors. My screen flashed the results. The companies did not exist. They were shell corporations registered to a holding company in Delaware, a holding company that upon closer inspection traced right back to Harrison. My brother, the supposed financial genius of the family, was fabricating fake sales invoices to artificially inflate the company revenue. They were literally making up money out of thin air to make the balance sheet look attractive to buyers. I dug deeper, tracing the inventory logs. They claimed to have completely full warehouses of highly specialized surgical equipment. But the freight and shipping expense reports told a totally different story. You cannot ship thousands of medical devices without paying a massive transportation bill. Their shipping costs were practically non-existent. The warehouses were empty. Caldwell Medical Solutions was not a thriving enterprise. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a chilling sense of realization. The company was a rotting corpse propped up by forged documents and desperate lies. It had been functionally bankrupt for at least 3 years. Richard and Harrison had run my grandfather's legacy into the ground. They had likely drained the operating capital to fund their luxury cars, their expensive country club memberships, and their desperate need to appear wealthy to their suburban neighbors. When the money ran out, they did not restructure or cut costs. Instead, they took out massive high-interest commercial loans using the failing business as collateral. They were using new debt to pay off old debt. It was a classic Ponzi scheme setup, masquerading as a legitimate medical supplier. And now the walls were closing in on them. The banks were surely threatening foreclosure. So Richard devised a master plan. Package the dead company, wrap it in fake financial statements, and sell it to a New York investment group for $25 million before the whole thing exploded. They planned to take the cash, pay off their personal debts, and leave my firm holding an empty, worthless shell. My father had just sent me a message calling me a failure and banning me from a high society birthday party. He bragged about his elite status and his $25 million buyout. He had no idea he had just handed a detailed confession of federal wire fraud directly to the senior partner of the acquiring firm. The sheer arrogance was staggering. I pulled up the employee payroll records out of pure curiosity. I wanted to see how much they were paying Stephanie's loudmouth husband, Bradley. I found his name listed as an external independent consultant. His compensation was absurdly high for someone with zero background in corporate mergers. It became instantly clear what his role was. Bradley was the useful idiot. Richard needed a scapegoat, someone dumb enough to sign his name on the broker documents, so that when the federal investigators eventually figured out the fraud, Bradley would be the one facing the immediate legal fallout. My sister was bragging about her husband's brilliance, while her own father was setting him up to take the fall for a federal crime. I continued scrolling through the recent bank ledger, analyzing the cash flow from the past 30 days. If the company was this close to total default, every penny should have been locked down. But a glaring red flag popped up on the screen. A massive unauthorized withdrawal had been executed just 48 hours ago. Someone had bypassed the standard corporate approval process and pulled a staggering amount of liquid cash directly from the company payroll account. It was a severe violation of our acquisition agreement, which strictly prohibited any major unapproved financial movements during the due diligence period. I traced the routing number of the withdrawal. The funds did not go to a medical supplier. They did not go to a shipping vendor. The money had been wired directly to an elite event planning agency and a high-end luxury boutique. Richard and Patricia were actively draining the last remaining drops of stolen corporate funds to pay for a ridiculously lavish birthday gala and a $15,000 designer dress. They were throwing a massive party to celebrate a fraudulent buyout using stolen money while explicitly banning the one daughter who actually knew how to read a balance sheet. But the ledger revealed one more detail. A detail so deeply personal and twisted that it made the blood freeze in my veins. The cash they withdrew to fund this glamorous weekend did not just come from the empty company accounts. It was tied to a secondary collateral line linked directly to my grandfather's trust fund. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard corporate firewalls to access the deeper banking structures associated with Caldwell Medical Solutions. The secondary collateral line was a masterpiece of financial camouflage, but it could not hide from someone who disassembled offshore accounts for a living. I traced the routing numbers through 2 shell accounts until the ultimate source materialized on my screen. The money funding my mother's lavish birthday gala was not coming from a corporate credit line. It was bleeding directly out of the irrevocable trust fund my grandfather had established for me. I sat perfectly still, listening to the hum of the air conditioning in the glass conference room. The trust fund was supposed to be untouchable. My grandfather had explicitly structured it so that no one in the family could access the principal without my direct physical signature. I immediately logged into the secure banking portal and pulled the transaction history for the past 90 days. The account was completely drained. Every single dollar my grandfather had set aside to protect me from my parents had been liquidated. I downloaded the authorization forms the bank had on file for the withdrawal. A PDF loaded onto my screen displaying a transfer request for hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the bottom of the final page, sitting right above the date, was my signature. Or rather, a clumsy, desperate attempt at my signature. The loop on the M was too wide, and the angle of the last letter was entirely wrong. It was a blatant, sloppy forgery. But a forged signature alone would not bypass a major financial institution. Someone had to verify it. I scrolled down to the notary section. The official stamp and signature belonged to Thomas Kensington, the longtime attorney who had represented my father for decades. Kensington had known me since I was a child. He knew exactly what my father was capable of, and yet he had legally notarized a forged document allowing Richard and Patricia to steal their own daughter's inheritance. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. My mother had just called me a stubborn, ungrateful obstacle. My father had banned me from his high society triumph because I was a failure who would ruin their image. Meanwhile, they were drinking expensive champagne and trying on custom designer gowns paid for entirely with the money they had stolen from me. The birthday party they forbade me from attending was being funded by my own stolen inheritance. Years ago, when my father threw my suitcases into the rain, my mother had stood on the porch and told me I owed them for every bite of food I had ever eaten under their roof. She told me I was a financial burden they were finally shedding. Now they were committing grand larceny and federal wire fraud to maintain the illusion of their suburban wealth. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to paralyze me when I was younger. I only felt a cold, lethal precision. They had crossed the line from toxic family members to actual criminals. And they had done it right in front of a forensic auditor holding the keys to their fake $25 million buyout. I opened a secure encrypted folder on my desktop and began transferring every piece of evidence. The forged signature, the fake European invoices, the empty warehouse shipping logs, the unauthorized trust fund withdrawals. I documented every single felony they had committed in the last 30 days alone. Just as I finished saving the final bank ledger, my email notification chimed. It was an urgent message sent directly to my personal inbox. The sender was my older brother Harrison. The subject line read, "Final warning before legal action." I clicked the email open. Harrison never wrote his own emails. He always had his assistant do it, but the aggressive entitlement in the words was undeniably his. "Madeline, you are pushing your luck. Mom is in tears because you are being incredibly selfish about the 10% company shares. Dad is ready to cut you out of our lives permanently. Bradley has the New York investors ready to sign the final buyout papers this weekend, and we are not letting a bitter dropout sabotage our payout. If you do not sign the relinquishment forms and transfer your shares back to the family estate by Friday morning, we are going to court. Dad has already spoken to Kensington. If you refuse to cooperate, we are filing a massive lawsuit against you for retroactive room and board. We will legally bill you for every single expense this family incurred raising you, including private school tuition, food, and the emotional distress you caused Mom when you abandoned us at 18. Do not test us, Madeline. You cannot afford a legal battle against a family that is about to be worth $25 million. Sign the papers, or we will bury you in debt for the rest of your pathetic life." I read the threat twice. My brother, the fake vice president of a bankrupt company, was threatening to sue me for childhood expenses while actively participating in the theft of my trust fund. He was trying to intimidate me with the very wealth he was currently begging my firm to give him. I leaned back and looked at the Manhattan skyline outside my window. They wanted a legal battle. They wanted to talk about who owed who. I reached for my phone to call the venue they had booked for the party. It was time to set the perfect trap. Harrison's email glared back at me from the high-definition screen. He actually used the word abandoned. He accused me of abandoning them. The sheer delusion required to type those words was almost clinically fascinating. He wanted me to pay for the emotional distress of a night that had nearly destroyed my life. He wanted to retroactively bill me for the food I ate as a child if I did not immediately surrender my grandfather's stock. 16 years ago, the driveway was slick with freezing November rain. I can still smell the burning rubber and the sharp sting of leaked radiator fluid. Harrison had stumbled out of my father's prized vintage Porsche, reeking of expensive bourbon and cheap decisions. He had wrapped the front end of the luxury car around a stone retaining wall just 2 miles from our house. It was his third severe accident in 18 months. One more strike and the judge had promised him mandatory jail time. My father did not ask if Harrison was injured. He did not ask if anyone else was hurt. Richard dragged me out of my bed at 2 in the morning, shoved a pen into my hand, and pointed at the police report the responding officer was holding. "Tell them you were driving." Richard had hissed his fingers digging into my collarbone hard enough to leave dark purple bruises. "Tell them you took the car without asking. You are 18. You have a clean record. They will just give you a warning. Harrison cannot survive a prison sentence, Madeline. Do it for your family." I refused. I stood shivering in the freezing rain, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser, and told the officer exactly who had been behind the wheel. The slap my father delivered knocked me straight to the wet asphalt. Within 30 minutes, my clothes were stuffed into garbage bags and hurled out the front door. Patricia, my loving mother, simply tightened her cashmere wrap and turned her back, wrapping her arms protectively around Harrison. I was dead to them because I refused to be a human shield for a criminal. And now that same criminal was sitting in a fake executive office threatening to sue me into poverty if I did not hand over the last piece of my inheritance. I did not feel the familiar panic that used to seize my chest when they yelled at me. The scared 18-year-old girl shivering in the rain was entirely gone. In her place sat a senior partner who dismantled financial predators before her morning coffee. Harrison thought his email was a brilliant intimidation tactic designed to force my hand. I saw it for what it truly was, a documented written confession of extortion. I clicked the forward button on my email client. I typed the address for Jonathan Pierce, the ruthless head of our firm's internal corporate litigation department. I kept my instructions brief and entirely clinical. "Jonathan, please review the attached correspondence from Harrison Caldwell. He is explicitly demanding the transfer of highly valuable corporate securities under the direct threat of a retaliatory lawsuit and financial ruin. Given that this threat was transmitted electronically across state lines to a New York financial institution, it qualifies as federal extortion and wire fraud. Please add this to the growing Caldwell criminal profile. Do not send a cease and desist. Let them believe they have the upper hand. We will file the formal felony charges alongside the Securities and Exchange Commission violations on Monday." I hit send. The trap was set, and Harrison had just willingly stepped right into it. He wanted to play hardball with a forensic accountant while handing over a digital paper trail of his own felonies. It was almost too easy. With the extortion securely logged with my legal team, I returned my attention to the bank ledger. I needed to know exactly where my stolen inheritance had gone. The massive withdrawal from my grandfather's trust fund had been routed through a shell account and then wired directly to an elite event planning conglomerate. But the specific vendor identification number attached to the final deposit caught my eye. I ran the vendor identification number through the commercial real estate database. The screen populated with the details of the venue my parents had booked for the lavish birthday gala. They were not just renting a standard hotel ballroom or a high-end restaurant. They had secured a location that required a $250,000 deposit just to reserve the date. The name of the venue flashed in bold black letters across my monitor: the Grand Oak Manor. It was the most exclusive hyper-luxury event estate in the entire state. a sprawling historic mansion known for hosting political summits, celebrity weddings, and elite corporate retreats. My parents were blowing hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars to play pretend billionaires in a venue they could never legitimately afford on their own. They were using my stolen money to fund the ultimate illusion of success. I leaned back in my leather chair, and a slow, lethal smirk spread across my face. Richard and Patricia thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They thought they had secured the ultimate stage to flaunt their fake wealth and finalize their fraudulent $25 million buyout. They thought they had banned their disappointment of a daughter from ruining their high society triumph. But they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They clearly had not checked the commercial property records for the last fiscal year. If they had, they would have noticed the recent change in ownership. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct private line for the estate manager of the Grand Oak Manor. They were about to find out exactly who owned the red carpet they were planning to walk on. The Grand Oak Manor was a legendary property. Spanning 50 acres of pristine manicured landscape, it featured crystal chandeliers, imported Italian marble floors, and a reputation for absolute exclusivity. My father was undoubtedly spending his days parading around his local country club, boasting loudly about securing the entire estate for my mother's 60th birthday. He was probably telling his golf buddies and local politicians that the Caldwell family had officially entered the stratosphere of the ultra-wealthy. He was selling them the grand illusion of a $25 million empire, using a venue he believed validated his newfound elite status. What Richard completely failed to realize was how private equity actually works. We do not just buy companies or shuffle spreadsheets. We buy land. We buy commercial infrastructure. We buy the very ground the fake elite walk on. 14 months ago, my firm tasked me with diversifying our physical real estate portfolio. I orchestrated the quiet, highly lucrative acquisition of a holding company that managed premier event spaces across the East Coast. The Grand Oak Manor was the crown jewel of that specific acquisition. Legally on paper, the sprawling estate belonged to a faceless, limited liability corporation. Practically and functionally, it belonged entirely to me. My parents had stolen my grandfather's trust fund to pay a massive rental fee directly to their own discarded daughter. I pressed the phone to my ear, waiting through 2 short rings. The polished, commanding voice of the estate general manager answered immediately. His name was Winston, and he ran the property with ruthless, absolute efficiency. "Good afternoon," Madeline, Winston said, recognizing my private, secure number. "How can I assist you today?" "Winston, I need you to pull up the reservation file for an upcoming event this Saturday," I instructed, keeping my tone strictly professional. "It is a 60th birthday gala booked under the name Richard Caldwell." I heard the swift clacking of a high-end keyboard on his end of the line. "Ah yes, the Caldwell Gala," he confirmed. "It is a full estate buyout. They have requested our top-tier catering package, enhanced security details, and the grand ballroom for a guest list of 200 people. They have been exceptionally demanding clients, to be perfectly honest. The wife, Patricia, has called my staff 5 times today just to complain about the shade of the table linens." I smiled at the window, looking out over the endless concrete canyons of Manhattan. "I am sure they have been, Winston. I need you to listen to me very carefully. The Caldwell family is completely unaware of my connection to this property or my position at the firm they are trying to impress. I want it to stay exactly that way until I arrive on Saturday night." "Understood," Winston replied without hesitation. "Do we need to cancel their booking due to their hostile conduct towards the staff?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I want you to give them exactly what they asked for and a little bit more. Let them feel like absolute royalty from the second they arrive to set up the venue. Give Richard the premium parking spot at the front entrance so he can show off his leased luxury car. Let Patricia order your staff around as much as she pleases without any pushback. Agree to every single arrogant demand my sister Stephanie makes regarding the lighting and the floral arrangements. I want their egos inflated to the absolute maximum capacity. I want them floating high on air." Winston paused, clearly sensing the lethal trap being laid. He was a smart man who understood the games of the wealthy, and when the party actually begins, When the party begins, you will ensure that the audio and visual systems in the grand ballroom are linked directly to a secure presentation file I will provide to your technical director, I instructed. Furthermore, I need you to coordinate privately with your head of security. There will be federal agents arriving at the property later in the evening. Your guards are to grant them immediate unrestricted access to the main ballroom the moment I give the specific signal. Consider it done, Magdalene Winston said, his voice carrying a note of deep professional respect. The trap is fully set. They will not suspect a thing until it is far too late. I ended the call and rested my hands heavily on the Caldwell Medical Acquisition file. The standard corporate protocol for discovering massive financial fraud during a due diligence audit was incredibly simple. You immediately terminate the acquisition. You lock down all the communication channels, and you forward the findings directly to the federal authorities. Canceling the $25 million deal right now would instantly bankrupt my father. It would trigger a rapid chain reaction of commercial loan defaults that would strip him of his house, his cars, and his fake corporate title by next Tuesday morning. But a quiet administrative cancellation sent via email was entirely too merciful for Richard and Patricia. If I simply pulled the plug from my office in Manhattan, they would spin the story to their advantage. They would tell their suburban friends that the New York investors were too cheap or that the market conditions suddenly changed. They would play the tragic victims of a bad economy. They would never admit they were caught committing federal fraud and stealing from their own child. They wanted a massive public spectacle. They wanted to use my stolen inheritance to parade their fake success in front of the local elite and the New York investors. It was only fair that I gave them exactly what they paid for. I wanted them surrounded by everyone they wanted to impress when the walls finally collapsed. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct extension for the executive managing director of our investment board. He was the powerful man my father was desperately trying to impress to secure the final payout. "Madeline," he answered briskly. "Are we finalizing the Caldwell Medical acquisition today? I know Richard Caldwell is eager to close before the weekend." I looked at the forged signature on my trust fund documents and the fake revenue invoices printed on my desk. "We are doing something much better," I replied, my voice cold and precise. "Do not cancel the travel arrangements. I am formally approving the travel budget for you and the entire investment board. Pack your absolute best evening wear. We are all flying down to attend the Caldwell birthday gala in person this Saturday. I will conduct the final financial due diligence presentation live at their dinner table." The managing director chuckled, a sound of pure corporate anticipation. He knew my tone well. It was the tone I used right before I dismantled a corrupt company and handed the executives over to the authorities. "I will have the board ready for departure," he said. "See you on Saturday, Madeline." I hung up the phone and closed the thick manila folder. My family wanted to ban me from their celebration to protect their pride. Instead, I was bringing the entire execution squad right to their front door. With the extortion threat from Harrison securely forwarded to my litigation team and the management of the Grand Oak Manor fully briefed on the impending chaos, I turned my attention to the weakest link in my family's fraudulent chain. My younger sister Stephanie had been terribly eager to boast about her husband in her spiteful audio message. She had proudly proclaimed that Bradley was the mastermind broker securing the $25 million buyout for my father. She paraded his name around as if he were a titan of Wall Street. It was time to see exactly what kind of financial titan Bradley really was. I opened a new search terminal on my secure workstation and accessed the National Financial Regulatory Database. As a senior partner at a top-tier private equity firm, I possessed clearance to view the licensing and registration history of anyone claiming to operate within the corporate financial sector. I typed Bradley's full legal name into the registry and waited for the results. The database returned a profile that was almost comical in its inadequacy. Bradley did not hold a single license required to broker corporate acquisitions. He was not registered with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. He had absolutely zero background in investment banking or corporate mergers. According to his official filing history, Bradley was certified solely to sell basic term life insurance and standard auto policies out of a small rented office in a suburban strip mall. Yet when I pulled up the heavily forged valuation documents Richard and Harrison had submitted to my firm, there was Bradley's signature printed boldly at the bottom of every single page. He had officially signed off as the lead independent financial consultant, verifying the company's fake profits. I leaned closer to the monitor, dissecting the digital paper trail. Richard was a cruel and arrogant man, but he was not entirely stupid when it came to self-preservation. He knew that fabricating millions of dollars in fake international medical supply sales was a massive federal crime. He knew that if the acquisition went through and my firm eventually discovered the empty warehouses, the authorities would immediately look for the person who certified the financial health of the company. Richard needed a fall guy. He needed someone foolish enough and greedy enough to attach their legal identity to a sinking ship. He had found the perfect scapegoat in his own son-in-law. I traced the metadata hidden within the forged European invoice files. The digital fingerprints proved that Bradley did not just blindly sign the papers. He had actively participated in the deception. He had helped Harrison register the fake shell companies in Delaware. I found a sequence of encrypted emails where Bradley instructed my brother on how to bypass standard commercial banking alerts by breaking the stolen trust fund money into smaller, untraceable deposits. Bradley was charging my father an exorbitant consulting fee for this illegal service, and he was getting paid directly from the cash they had stolen from my grandfather's irrevocable trust. Stephanie was bragging to me about her luxurious new lifestyle, completely oblivious to the fact that her father had positioned her husband to take the hardest fall for a massive corporate fraud scheme. Bradley was actively committing federal wire fraud, acting as an unregistered broker-dealer, and engaging in a multi-million-dollar conspiracy to defraud a New York investment group. He was staring down the barrel of decades in a federal penitentiary, and he thought he was about to become a millionaire. I felt absolutely no pity for him or my sister. They had chosen to feast on my stolen inheritance. Now they were going to choke on it. I opened a heavily encrypted communication portal on my desktop. This was a direct, secure line to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Over my years of dismantling corrupt corporate entities, I had cultivated a solid working relationship with several high-ranking federal investigators who specialized in complex corporate fraud. They knew that when I sent a whistleblower file, it was never a waste of their time. I began compiling the digital dossier with surgical precision. I labeled the first folder Exhibit A and uploaded the fake valuation reports bearing Bradley's signature. I created Exhibit B and attached the routing numbers proving the unauthorized liquidation of my grandfather's trust fund. Exhibit C contained the metadata linking Harrison and Bradley to the empty shell corporations. I included the fraudulent shipping logs, the non-existent inventory reports, and the extortion email Harrison had sent me earlier that morning. I drafted a concise executive summary detailing how Caldwell Medical Solutions was attempting to defraud a major Manhattan private equity firm by inflating their company value to $25 million. I outlined the flight risk posed by Richard and Harrison, emphasizing their active theft of trust fund assets to pay for a lavish high society gala happening this very weekend. I attached the exact address of the Grand Oak Manor, highlighting it as the location where the perpetrators would be gathering. I addressed the secure package to a specific lead investigator at the SEC and copied the Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI. I clicked send and watched the progress bar hit 100%. The federal machinery was now officially in motion. Warrants would be drafted. Subpoenas would be issued. The trap was locked. I closed my laptop and stood up, looking out at the fading afternoon light hitting the Manhattan skyline. The work week was over. The financial autopsy was complete. Now it was time to prepare for the execution. I left my office and took a private car back to my penthouse apartment. The silence of my home was a stark contrast to the storm I had just unleashed. I walked directly into my expansive walk-in closet, bypassing the tailored business suits and sensible corporate heels. Saturday night required a very specific type of armor. I moved to the section holding my formal evening wear and pulled out a custom-designed floor-length gown. It was crafted from heavy, luxurious silk in a striking shade of deep midnight blue. It was elegant, intimidating, and screamed of a quiet, untouchable wealth that a $15,000 suburban dress could never possibly match. I paired it with the simple, flawless diamond pendant my grandfather had given me the year before he died. I walked over to my vanity and picked up my personal phone. I opened the digital invitation link for my mother's 60th birthday gala, the exact same party my father had furiously commanded me to stay away from, the party my sister had mocked me for being too poor to attend. I typed my full name into the guest registry. I checked the box confirming my attendance. I smiled at my reflection in the mirror and firmly pressed submit. The drive from the private airstrip to the Grand Oak Manor took exactly 45 minutes. I sat in the back of the chauffeured town car, watching the dense city lights give way to the sprawling, manicured darkness of the wealthy Connecticut suburbs. My phone remained perfectly silent in my evening clutch. The federal agents were already in position waiting for my signal. The executive board from my private equity firm had checked into their luxury suites downtown and were currently en route to the venue. The stage was set perfectly. As my car turned onto the long, winding driveway of the estate, the sheer scale of my parents' financial delusion came into full view. The Grand Oak Manor looked like a royal palace illuminated against the night sky. Massive floodlights bathed the historic stone facade in a warm, golden glow. A fleet of valets in crisp white uniforms rushed to open doors for arriving guests. Expensive sports cars and luxury sedans lined the circular driveway. I could see the massive crystal chandeliers blazing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom. My grandfather's stolen trust fund had bought them a spectacular illusion. My driver pulled smoothly up to the front steps. A valet hurried over and opened my door. I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The crisp evening air caught the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown. I did not rush. I walked up the sweeping marble staircase with the measured, confident stride of a woman who literally owned the ground she was walking on. The heavy mahogany double doors were propped wide open, flanked by towering floral arrangements that must have cost thousands of dollars alone. I handed my coat to a waiting attendant and stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer. The main ballroom was a masterpiece of high society excess. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in tailored vests circulated with silver trays of champagne flutes and caviar canapes. Local politicians, wealthy country club members, and minor business executives mingled in their finest evening wear. They were completely captivated by the grand spectacle. Right in the center of the room stood my father. Richard was holding court. He had a glass of premium scotch in one hand and was gesturing expansively with the other, clearly boasting to a group of local real estate developers. He wore a custom tuxedo that fit his inflated ego perfectly. A few yards away, my brother Harrison was laughing loudly with some men who looked like minor investors. My sister Stephanie was showing off her $15,000 designer dress to a circle of envious suburban wives, while her husband Bradley stood by looking incredibly smug. They were playing their roles flawlessly. They were the triumphant, wealthy family on the verge of a massive corporate payout. They were untouchable. I began to walk across the ballroom floor. I did not sneak in. I did not hover by the edges of the room like an unwanted guest. I moved directly through the center of the crowd. The reaction was almost immediate. Heads began to turn. Conversations trailed off as people noticed my presence. In a room full of suburban housewives trying too hard to look expensive, my custom-tailored gown and the flawless diamond pendant resting against my collarbone commanded absolute attention. I radiated a cold, unbothered power that made people naturally step aside to clear a path for me. Richard was mid-sentence, laughing at his own joke when his eyes caught the movement in the crowd. He glanced over his scotch glass and locked eyes with me. The transformation on his face was instantaneous and glorious to witness. The arrogant smile vanished completely. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his face a sickly shade of pale gray. For a split second, I saw genuine panic flash in his eyes. He quickly excused himself from the group of developers, shoving his drink onto a passing waiter's tray, and marched directly toward me. He intercepted me near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the room, physically blocking my path. His body language was rigid, his shoulders hunched with barely contained fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper so the surrounding guests would not hear. "I told you specifically that you were banned from this property. You have no right to show your face at my event." I looked at him calmly, completely unfazed by his aggression. "I received the digital invitation, Richard. I simply RSVP'd like any other polite guest." His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "You arrogant, ungrateful little brat," he growled, taking a threatening step closer. "You think you can just waltz in here in a rented dress and pretend you belong with these people? This is a private celebration for elite individuals. You are a failure. You are a disgrace to the Caldwell name. I want you to turn around, walk out those doors, and get back to whatever miserable life you lead. If you do not leave right now, I will have the security guards drag you out by your hair." I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. I just smiled, a slow, chilling smile that made his eyes widen with confusion. Before I could deliver my response, the sharp sound of a breaking glass echoed to our right. I turned my head slightly. My mother, Patricia, had spotted me. She was standing near the dessert table, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. She took one look at my calm demeanor and my father's furious face and instantly shifted into her favorite role, the victim. Patricia let out a loud theatrical gasp that effectively silenced the string quartet and drew the attention of every single guest in the ballroom. She pressed a hand to her chest, her face contorting into a mask of pure agony. "Oh my God," she wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. "Why is she here? Why is she doing this to us again?" She stumbled forward, leaning heavily on Stephanie, who had rushed to her side. Patricia began to sob openly, tears perfectly welling in her eyes as she addressed the stunned crowd of local elites. "Please, everyone, I am so sorry," she cried out, gesturing weakly toward me. "This is my estranged daughter. She is deeply troubled. She has severe mental stability issues, and she has been harassing our family for years. She only came here tonight to destroy my birthday and terrorize us because she is jealous of our success. Someone please get her away from my husband before she has another violent breakdown." The whispers in the grand ballroom grew louder, rippling through the crowd of local politicians and suburban socialites. My mother continued her theatrical sobbing, clinging to my sister, as if my mere presence was causing her physical pain. Several guests shot me looks of disgust, fully buying into the narrative that I was the unstable, estranged daughter arriving to ruin a beautiful family milestone. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression devoid of any emotion. Let them put on a show. It would only make the impending collapse that much more spectacular. Stephanie stepped forward, shielding my mother with one arm while glaring at me with absolute contempt. Her $15,000 gown looked stiff and over-designed next to the fluid elegance of my custom silk dress, but her arrogance blinded her to the contrast. She tilted her chin up, looking down her nose at me. "Are you completely insane?" Stephanie snapped, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Mom is shaking. You have successfully ruined the first half of the evening with your desperate need for attention. I told you specifically to stay in your lane, Madeline. But of course, the bitter dropout just had to come beg for a handout right when we are about to close the biggest financial deal of our lives." Her husband Bradley stepped up beside her, puffing out his chest to look physically intimidating. He adjusted his expensive but poorly tailored tuxedo jacket. He wanted to play the role of the protective, wealthy patriarch, defending his new fortune. "Look around you," Madeline, Bradley said, waving his hand dismissively at the opulent surroundings. "You do not belong here. These are high-net-worth individuals. We are hosting major Manhattan executives tonight to finalize a $25 million corporate buyout. I personally brokered this acquisition. I am ensuring this family enters a financial tier you cannot even comprehend. You showing up in a rented dress trying to extort your parents is pathetic." I looked at Bradley. This was the man who was actively committing federal wire fraud. This was the unlicensed amateur whose signature was currently sitting on the desk of an SEC investigator. The absolute certainty in his voice was a testament to his own profound ignorance. "I am not here to ask for anything, Bradley," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "I am here to witness the conclusion of your massive financial triumph. I just want to see exactly how this $25 million miracle plays out for all of you." My father sneered, taking a step closer. "You are not witnessing anything. You are leaving." Bradley let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to break me down in front of the local elite to prove his absolute superiority. He slowly pulled a crisp $100 bill from his money clip and held it up for the surrounding guests to see. "You want to see how real money works?" Bradley asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let me give you your first lesson." He flicked his wrist and dropped the $100 bill directly onto the plush custom-woven carpet at my feet. The green paper fluttered down, landing inches from my designer heels. "Take that and call a cab back to whatever miserable slum you crawled out of," Bradley commanded, gesturing to the exit. "Buy yourself a cheap dinner and try to forget you ever saw how the actual financial elite live. Do not dirty the red carpet of the upper class with your desperate poverty. You are a stain on this family, and you are a stain on this venue. Pick up the cash and get out before I have you thrown out." I did not look down at the money. I kept my eyes locked directly on Bradley, observing the smug, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. Stephanie clung to his arm, looking at me with pure, venomous satisfaction. My mother peeked out from behind her hands, her fake tears momentarily pausing so she could enjoy my public humiliation. My father crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with his son-in-law. "What is going on over here?" a loud voice boomed, cutting through the tense atmosphere. My older brother Harrison pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers. He looked flushed, likely from the premium open bar, and his eyes narrowed the second he spotted me standing near the ice sculpture. As the supposed future senior executive of Caldwell Medical, he felt the need to assert his authority. Madeline Harrison growled, marching up to join the hostile circle surrounding me. "I sent you a direct email outlining exactly what would happen if you pushed us. You have a lot of nerve showing up at our private event. I told you we were not playing games." He did not wait for my response. Harrison turned sharply toward the grand entrance and raised his hand, snapping his fingers aggressively in the air. "Security!" Harrison shouted, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "We need a state security over here immediately. We have an uninvited trespasser harassing the guests. Remove this woman from the premises right now. Use force if she resists." The guests murmured excitedly, stepping back to clear a wide path. The Caldwell family stood tall, radiating absolute confidence. They believed they held all the power. They believed their stolen money had bought them the authority to banish me from my own property. From the main corridor leading to the lobby, the heavy, rhythmic sound of synchronized footsteps approached. The Grand Oak Manor did not employ standard event bouncers. They employed a highly trained private security detail composed mostly of former military personnel dressed in immaculate dark suits with discreet earpieces. 6 security officers marched swiftly into the grand ballroom. They were large, intimidating men moving with absolute precision. My father smiled. My mother straightened her posture, dropping the victim act entirely. Stephanie and Bradley watched eagerly, waiting for the guards to grab my arms and drag me humiliated and screaming out the front doors. The security detail reached our circle, but they did not lunge toward me. They did not grab my arms. Instead, the 6 men stopped abruptly, just inches away from the dropped $100 bill. In perfect unison, they pivoted sharply and parted down the middle, forming 2 rigid parallel lines. They stood at strict military attention, creating a clear, protective perimeter directly in front of me. My family stared in stunned, absolute silence. The smug smiles vanished from their faces, instantly replaced by profound confusion. Through the center of the silent security formation walked Winston, the impeccably dressed general manager of the estate. He stepped onto the plush carpet, bypassing my father, bypassing Harrison, and stopping squarely in front of me. Winston stepped through the human wall of security guards with the immaculate grace of a man who commanded absolute authority over his domain. He did not look at my father. He did not spare a single glance for my brother Harrison, who was still holding his arm up in the air, expecting his command to be obeyed. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Local politicians and wealthy socialites craned their necks to watch the spectacle unfold. They were waiting for the dramatic removal of the unwanted daughter. They were waiting for the Caldwell family to secure their flawless social victory. Instead, Winston stopped precisely where the crisp green paper rested on the custom-woven carpet. He looked down at the $100 bill Bradley had thrown at my feet. The estate general manager slowly reached into his tailored breast pocket and produced a pair of pristine white cotton gloves. He slipped them onto his hands with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Every eye in the room tracked his movements. Winston bent at the waist and picked up the discarded cash. He turned to Bradley. My sister's husband puffed out his chest, preparing to receive an apology from the staff for the delay in my removal. Winston extended his white-gloved hand and pressed the $100 bill directly against Bradley's tuxedo jacket. "I believe you dropped this, sir," Winston said, his voice ringing with polite but absolute disdain. "We do not tolerate littering on the premises regardless of how little the trash happens to be worth." Bradley blinked rapidly. His arrogant smirk faltered as he reflexively took the cash. He opened his mouth to shout an insult, but the words died in his throat. Winston had already pivoted away from him. The estate manager turned to face me. The 6 massive security guards standing in parallel lines immediately straightened their posture even further. Winston placed his hands at his sides and bowed deeply, bending a full 90 degrees at the waist, in a display of profound, unwavering respect. "Boss, all security requests have been executed," Winston announced, his voice carrying clear and steady across the silent ballroom. "The perimeter is secured. The staff is operating under your direct command. We await your further instructions." The silence that crashed down on the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only occurs when a fundamental law of reality has just been shattered in front of a crowd. My father literally staggered backward. The expensive scotch sloshed wildly in his glass, spilling over the rim and staining his white cuffs. His mouth hung open. His eyes darted frantically between Winston, the wall of security guards, and me. He looked like a man who had just watched gravity reverse itself. My mother stopped breathing. Her theatrical tears completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a mask of raw, unadulterated terror. She dropped Stephanie's arm and took a shaky step back. Stephanie herself looked as though she had been physically struck. Her jaw went slack, and her hands trembled at her sides. Harrison let his raised arm fall limply to his side, his drunken confidence entirely erased by the terrifying realization that the security team was not there for me. They were there for him. I let the silence stretch. I let them suffocate in it. I looked down at the spot where the money had rested, and then I looked directly into my father's horrified eyes. "You really should research the commercial property records before you attempt to flaunt your stolen wealth, Richard," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "You spent the last month bragging to every country club member in the state that you managed to secure the Grand Oak Manor for this pathetic display of fake prosperity. You believed your stolen money bought you the authority to banish me from the premises." I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The security guards perfectly adjusted their formation to move with me. "I own this estate." I declared, the words hitting them like physical blows. "The holding company that manages this entire property belongs exclusively to my private equity firm. I bought the deed to this historic mansion 14 months ago. Every single chandelier you are standing under, every marble tile you are walking on, and the very red carpet your fraudulent son-in-law just tried to insult me on is my personal property." Bradley let out a strangled, choking sound. He looked at the $100 bill in his hand, and then stared at the sprawling, multi-million-dollar ballroom surrounding him. The realization of his profound stupidity was visibly crushing him. He had just tried to buy off a woman who literally owned the most expensive real estate in the entire region. "You took the money my grandfather left me." I continued, raising my voice just enough to ensure the surrounding guests heard every single word. You forged my signature and drained my irrevocable trust fund to pay the massive rental deposit for this venue. You used my stolen inheritance to pay the rental fee directly into my own corporate bank account. You paid me to stand here and watch you destroy yourselves. Harrison let out a desperate stammering sound. He tried to step forward, but the lead security guard immediately placed a massive hand on his chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. That is impossible. My father finally choked out his voice, a weak, raspy whisper. You are lying. You do not have that kind of capital. You are just a dropout. You cannot possibly own this. Before I could explain exactly how many billions of dollars in commercial real estate I currently managed, a low rhythmic thudding sound began to vibrate through the heavy crystal chandeliers above us. The noise grew louder and more intense with each passing second. It was the distinct, powerful chopping sound of heavy helicopter blades cutting through the night air directly over the estate. The guests gasped and pointed toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the front courtyard. Powerful searchlights swept across the pristine, manicured lawns. Simultaneously, a fleet of elongated black luxury SUVs and heavily armored limousines turned off the main highway and glided aggressively up the sweeping cobblestone driveway. The headlights cut through the darkness, pulling to a sharp, synchronized halt right at the front entrance of my property. My father spun around, staring at the arriving convoy. He recognized the corporate logos discreetly displayed on the lead vehicles. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The elite Manhattan Investment Board had arrived. The very people he was trying to scam out of $25 million were stepping out of the vehicles, and they were walking directly into the slaughterhouse I had prepared exclusively for them. Richard deliberately turned his back on the imposing wall of security personnel guarding me. His mind, poisoned by decades of narcissism and unchecked greed, was violently rejecting the reality I had just established. In his distorted worldview, money was the ultimate eraser of all sins and the solution to every problem. He truly believed that if he could just get those Manhattan executives into a private room and secure their signatures on the acquisition paperwork, my ownership of the estate and the stolen trust fund would simply cease to matter. $25 million would buy him a legal team formidable enough to crush whatever minor threats he assumed I was throwing at him. He physically pushed his way through the crowd of stunned local politicians and country club socialites. He dragged a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, frantically wiping the spilled premium scotch from his cuffs, while attempting to plaster his signature charismatic smile back onto his face. The local elite watched him scramble. The polished facade of the untouchable Caldwell family was cracking wide open right in front of their eyes, but Richard was too blinded by his own financial desperation to notice the disgusted whispers rippling through the grand ballroom. "Harrison, get yourself together!" Richard hissed entirely, ignoring the tension radiating from the guests around them. He snapped his fingers at my brother, whose face was still a sickly shade of gray. "Patricia, fix your makeup and smile. Bradley, stand up straight and get the contract portfolios ready. The buyers are here. We are closing this deal tonight." He was acting like a desperate captain on a sinking ship, demanding the band keep playing while the water rushed in. He thought he could salvage the night through sheer, arrogant willpower. The towering mahogany double doors of the grand foyer swung open entirely. A gust of crisp autumn air swept into the warm ballroom, carrying the sharp, faint scent of aviation fuel from the landed helicopters. The executives from my Manhattan private equity firm stepped over the threshold. They did not look like the flashy suburban pretenders Richard normally associated with. They wore bespoke tailored suits in charcoal and midnight black. They moved with the silent, predatory efficiency of men and women who dictated global market trends and dismantled massive corporations before breakfast. They were the apex predators of the financial world, bringing a freezing wave of authentic corporate power into a room built entirely on suburban illusions. Leading the pack was the chairman of our investment board. He was a ruthless, brilliant strategist who had personally overseen the liquidation of dozens of corrupt companies. He walked into the ballroom with absolute authority, his sharp eyes scanning the opulent surroundings with cold, analytical precision. Richard lunged forward. He practically sprinted across the custom-woven carpet, abandoning his trembling wife and children behind him. He threw his arms open wide in a gesture of fake camaraderie, his voice booming with forced enthusiastic warmth, in a desperate bid to command the room. "Mr. Chairman, welcome to Connecticut!" Richard nearly shouted, his voice cracking slightly with frantic anticipation. "Welcome to the Grand Oak Manor. We are so incredibly honored that you and your esteemed board flew out personally to celebrate with us tonight. As you can see, Caldwell Medical Solutions is a family legacy built on absolute excellence and elite success." Richard extended his hand, a slick, sweaty smile plastered across his face. He was vibrating with nervous energy. He took another step, getting uncomfortably close to the powerful executive. "We have prepared our finest private dining room for your team so we can finalize the $25 million acquisition paperwork before the main festivities begin." Richard continued, speaking rapidly to prevent any interruptions. "My lead broker, Bradley, is standing by with all the necessary documents highlighting our massive international revenue streams. We are ready to sign and make you all very wealthy men." He thought he was seconds away from securing his fraudulent fortune. He thought he was about to prove me wrong in front of the entire county. He held his hand out, waiting for the firm handshake that would validate his entire miserable existence. The chairman stopped. He did not extend his hand. He did not return the smile. He simply looked at Richard's outstretched hand with an expression of profound clinical distaste. The silence in the room deepened, reaching a level of tension that felt physically suffocating. Even the waitstaff froze in place, holding their silver trays perfectly still. The chairman slowly raised his gaze, examining Richard from head to toe. He looked at the spilled drink stains on the tuxedo, the desperate sweat forming on Richard's forehead, and the frantic, manic gleam in his eyes. He looked at my father the way a scientist might look at a particularly repulsive insect under a microscope. Then the chairman looked past him entirely. He surveyed the ballroom, taking in the shocked faces of the local guests, the terrified figures of my mother and sister, and finally the impenetrable wall of elite security guards standing at strict military attention in the center of the room. His eyes locked directly onto mine. What happened next shattered the final remaining piece of Richard Caldwell's ego into absolute dust. The chairman did not say a single word to my father. He treated Richard like an invisible obstacle, a piece of insignificant garbage blocking his path. The chairman stepped smoothly around my father, leaving Richard standing there frozen with his hand extended to empty air. The entire executive board followed suit, parting around my father like water flowing around a stone, completely ignoring his existence. They walked with unified purpose directly toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd of socialites parted instantly, too intimidated by their presence to even breathe loudly. Winston stepped aside, and the heavy security guards seamlessly opened their defensive formation, allowing the Manhattan executives to enter my protected perimeter. The chairman stopped precisely 2 feet in front of me. He buttoned his suit jacket and bowed his head in a gesture of absolute professional deference. "Good evening, senior partner," the chairman said, his voice carrying a resonant, commanding weight that echoed through the dead, silent ballroom. "The executive board is fully assembled and ready for your presentation. Is your financial due diligence report on Caldwell Medical Solutions prepared for our review?" The words spoken by the chairman hung in the dead silent air of the grand ballroom like a confirmed execution order. Every single person in the room, from the wealthy country club members to the terrified waitstaff, stopped breathing. My father, Richard, stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk he had worn just moments before was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of absolute horror. He finally understood the magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. The $25 million savior he had been praying to was actually reporting directly to the daughter he had just tried to throw out on the street. I did not break eye contact with the chairman. I gave him a single sharp professional nod. "The financial due diligence report is fully prepared and ready for your immediate review," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the vast space. "In fact, I believe the stakeholders present tonight deserve to see exactly what they are investing their reputations in." I raised my hand and gave a sharp 2-finger signal to Winston, who was standing perfectly still by the main doors. The estate manager immediately spoke a quiet command into his discreet earpiece. Within seconds, the brilliant crystal chandeliers illuminating the ballroom dimmed to a cinematic low glow. The soft string quartet ceased playing entirely. Behind the elevated stage where my parents had planned to cut a towering tiered cake, a massive high-definition projection screen slowly descended from the ceiling. My mother Patricia let out a sudden, desperate gasp of hope. She genuinely believed this was a planned surprise. She thought the screen was coming down to play her expensive, heavily edited birthday montage filled with fake family smiles and hollow congratulations. She stepped forward, clapping her hands together, expecting a glowing tribute to her flawless suburban life. Instead, the screen flashed a blinding white before settling into a stark corporate presentation. The Caldwell Medical Solutions logo dominated the center of the display, but stretching diagonally across the entire image in bold, glowing red letters was a single terrifying word: fraudulent. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of local socialites and politicians. People began whispering frantically, pointing at the massive red warning. I turned my body to face the projection screen, taking my place as the senior partner leading the most brutal financial autopsy of my career. I ignored my mother's panicked whimpers and focused entirely on the elite Manhattan investment board standing at attention before me. Gentlemen, I began my tone clinical and absolutely lethal. Over the past 72 hours, my forensic accounting team has conducted a comprehensive deep dive into the federal tax returns and internal banking ledgers of Caldwell Medical Solutions. The pitch deck you received, claiming a $25 million valuation, is a complete work of fiction. This company is not a thriving enterprise. It is a rotting financial corpse that has been functionally bankrupt for 3 consecutive years. I clicked a small remote in my hand and the slide transitioned. A complex web of bank routing numbers and offshore accounts illuminated the dark room. Let us begin with their claimed revenue. I continued gesturing to the left side of the screen. Richard and his vice president Harrison Caldwell reported massive sales volumes to international medical distributors in Europe and Asia. They logged these transactions to artificially inflate their earnings and make the balance sheet highly attractive to our firm. However, a simple cross-reference of the federal tax identification numbers reveals the truth. These international distributors do not exist. They are empty shell corporations registered in Delaware by Harrison Caldwell himself. My brother let out a strangled, pathetic noise from the edge of the crowd. I did not even bother to look at him. They have been fabricating fake sales invoices to generate phantom money out of thin air, I announced, my voice echoing off the marble pillars. They claim to have fully stocked warehouses of specialized surgical equipment, but their commercial freight and shipping expense reports are practically non-existent. You cannot export millions of dollars in medical supplies without paying for cargo transport. Their warehouses are entirely empty. Caldwell Medical Solutions produces nothing. They sell nothing. They are running a desperate Ponzi scheme using new high-interest commercial loans to pay off old debts, all while draining the remaining operating capital to fund their luxury vehicles and country club memberships. The murmurs in the crowd morphed into outright shock. The local real estate developers and minor politicians who had been praising my father just 10 minutes ago were now physically backing away from him as if his sudden poverty was a contagious disease. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to display a highly magnified image of a signature. It was the signature on the fraudulent valuation document submitted to my firm. To legitimize this massive deception, they required an independent financial broker to certify the fake profits. I explained, looking directly at my sister Stephanie and her terrified husband. They chose Bradley, a man who holds absolutely zero corporate brokerage licenses and only sells basic term life insurance out of a suburban strip mall. Bradley actively participated in this federal wire fraud by helping Harrison bypass commercial banking alerts and route stolen money through untraceable deposits. Bradley's knees physically buckled. He grabbed onto a cocktail table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. Stephanie stared at him with her mouth wide open, her $15,000 dress suddenly looking like a prison uniform. I turned my gaze back to the Manhattan executives. The sheer audacity of this crime is staggering, I concluded. They plan to take our $25 million payout, clear their personal debts, and leave our firm holding an empty, worthless shell. They assumed we were foolish enough to hand them a fortune without verifying a single piece of paper. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on my brother. Harrison realized his entire life was over. He realized the federal authorities would be arriving at any moment. In a sudden blind panic, he lunged forward. He let out a furious, desperate scream and charged blindly toward the audiovisual control table set up near the stage. He thought he could stop the execution by simply ripping the power cords out of the wall. He thought shutting off the screen would somehow erase the digital evidence sitting safely on federal servers. He did not make it past the first row of tables. Two of the massive ex-military security guards intercepted him with terrifying speed. They hit Harrison with the combined force of a freight train. The impact lifted my brother off his feet and slammed him violently into the polished hardwood floor. A table full of crystal champagne flutes crashed down around him, shattering into thousands of glittering pieces. The guards swiftly pinned his arms behind his back, driving their knees into his spine and neutralizing the threat in less than 3 seconds. My father Richard could no longer maintain his arrogant posture. The illusion was completely shattered. The money was gone. The reputation was destroyed. He dropped heavily to his knees right in the middle of the custom-woven carpet. His hands trembled violently as he clutched at his chest, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute ruin, and began to stammer pathetic, broken denials that no one in the room believed. I looked down at my father kneeling on the custom-woven carpet of my estate. His pathetic stammering echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. Harrison was still pinned to the floor by my security team, gasping for air and groaning in pain. The local elites who had been drinking his premium champagne and eating his imported caviar just minutes ago were now staring at him with absolute disgust. I did not offer him a single ounce of mercy. I turned my attention back to the Manhattan executives. The chairman stood perfectly still, his sharp eyes locked on the projection screen, absorbing every single piece of damning evidence. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the absolute perfection of the trap I had laid. But I was not finished dismantling them. I clicked the small remote in my hand one more time. The massive screen behind me shifted from the fraudulent corporate tax returns to a highly secure personal banking ledger. The executives in the room immediately recognized the complex format of a high-yield, irrevocable trust fund. This is where the corporate fraud intersects with domestic theft. I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the ballroom. Caldwell Medical Solutions was completely drained of operating capital. Richard and Patricia were so deeply buried in high-interest commercial debt, they could not even afford the deposit to rent a basic hotel banquet room for tonight. So they decided to fund their grand illusion by stealing from their own blood. The screen zoomed in on a specific withdrawal authorization form, displaying the exact routing numbers and transaction timestamps. My grandfather established this trust fund specifically to protect my future from their profound financial incompetence. I explained, pointing to the glowing numbers. It was legally structured to require my direct physical signature for any principal liquidation. Yet 48 hours ago, the entire account was drained down to absolute zero. Every single dollar was removed without my knowledge or consent. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a highly magnified image of the final signature page. That signature you see at the bottom is a sloppy, desperate forgery, I stated. And the notary stamp placed right next to it belongs to their longtime family attorney, who knowingly facilitated this grand larceny to help his favorite clients keep up appearances. They bypassed federal banking security to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars in a frantic bid to maintain their wealthy suburban facade. They needed to project an image of untouchable success to convince our private equity firm to hand them $25 million. I took a slow step closer to the crowd, ensuring my next words landed with maximum devastating impact. They routed that stolen money through a secondary shell account and wired it directly to the elite event planning conglomerate that manages this exact property. I looked directly at my mother, whose face was frozen in absolute unadulterated terror. The $250,000 check you wrote to secure the Grand Oak Manor for this lavish birthday gala was entirely funded by my stolen inheritance. You paid me with my own stolen money to rent my own property. The local politicians and real estate developers in the crowd began whispering frantically, stepping even further away from the Caldwell family. The sheer scale of the legal liability was radiating off my parents like toxic radiation. Therefore, this entire celebration is not a high society milestone, I declared, my voice ringing with finality. It is an active, ongoing crime scene. The very food you are eating, the crystal glasses you are holding, and the music you are listening to were all procured using funds generated by felony wire fraud and grand theft. You are standing in the middle of a massive financial crime. The sheer weight of the federal charges finally crushed whatever delusion my mother had left. Patricia realized that playing the victim of an estranged, mentally unstable daughter would not save her from a federal prison sentence. The designer gown she wore suddenly offered no protection against the reality of her actions. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that shattered her carefully maintained socialite persona completely. Patricia backed away from my father, her eyes wild with panic. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at his face, throwing decades of marriage and loyalty straight out the window to save her own skin. "It was his idea," Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with raw terror. "Richard forced me to do it. He said the New York investors would never sign the buyout agreement if we did not project absolute wealth. I told him not to touch the trust fund. I told him it was too risky. It is all his fault. I had nothing to do with the forgery." She threw her husband to the wolves in a matter of seconds, desperately trying to deflect the blame in front of the local elites and the Manhattan executives. Richard stared at his wife in shock, unable to comprehend how quickly she had turned on him. Stephanie watched her parents tear each other apart with wide, terrified eyes. The golden child suddenly realized her luxurious life was built on a mountain of federal felonies and fake money. Her $15,000 dress could not shield her from the fact that her family was about to be federally indicted. She spun around wildly, grabbing her husband by the lapels of his cheap tuxedo. "Bradley, do something!" Stephanie cried out, shaking him frantically. "Call your lawyers. Fix this right now. Tell them you did not know about the fake invoices. Tell them Richard lied to you. You are the broker. You have to get us out of this." But Bradley just stared blankly at the custom-woven carpet, completely paralyzed by fear. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the massive projection screen displaying the evidence of his own complicity and realized that he was already a dead man walking. Bradley violently shoved Stephanie away from him. The sudden, aggressive movement caused my sister to stumble backward in her heavy designer gown, nearly tripping over her own heels. Bradley smoothed the lapels of his poorly tailored tuxedo, taking a deep, ragged breath in a pathetic attempt to regain his composure. He realized that clinging to a sinking ship would only guarantee his own drowning. He completely ignored me and turned his desperate gaze directly toward the chairman of the Manhattan Investment Board. He desperately wanted to appeal to the highest authority in the room, hoping that corporate solidarity might save him from the execution block. "Listen to me," Bradley pleaded, his voice high-pitched and frantic, echoing across the vaulted ceiling of the grand ballroom. "I am an independent financial consultant. I was contracted by Caldwell Medical Solutions in good faith to facilitate an introduction to your prestigious firm. I relied entirely on the data provided to me by Richard and his internal accounting team. I had absolutely zero knowledge of any fabricated invoices, empty warehouses, or stolen trust funds. I am a victim of their deception just as much as anyone else standing in this room tonight." He raised his hands in a gesture of fake surrender, playing the innocent bystander with nauseating conviction. "I am completely prepared to cooperate with your firm," Bradley continued eagerly. "I will hand over all my communication logs with Richard. I will testify against them to help you recover any damages. You cannot hold an external broker responsible for the internal corruption of a rogue executive board." I stepped directly into his line of sight, blocking his view of the chairman. The Manhattan executive stood perfectly still, watching the psychological slaughter unfold with cold, professional interest. "You are not a victim, Bradley," I stated, my voice radiating a chilling, absolute calm. And you are certainly not a licensed corporate broker. You sell basic life insurance policies out of a suburban strip mall. But you are incredibly greedy. You saw an opportunity to play in the major leagues by enabling a desperate, arrogant old man who needed a disposable scapegoat. Bradley pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisting with sudden rage. You watch your mouth, you crazy, vindictive woman, he shouted. You are throwing baseless, defamatory accusations to ruin your family. I am a certified professional, and I will sue you for every single penny you own for slander. I did not flinch. I simply raised my hand and pressed the button on my presentation remote. The massive projection screen behind me shifted instantly. The crowd of local elites let out another collective gasp. The glowing red warning text vanished, replaced by the stark high-contrast display of a highly encrypted digital inbox. Dozens of emails filled the screen, highlighting exact dates, precise timestamps, and verified IP addresses. Baseless accusations are for amateurs, Bradley, I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, precise pitch. Forensic accountants deal exclusively in digital paper trails. When I traced the metadata embedded in the fraudulent European sales invoices, I found a direct link to a private, secure server. A server registered directly to your home address. Bradley froze. The aggressive pointing finger slowly lowered to his side. The false confidence drained entirely from his body, leaving a hollow, terrified shell standing on my custom-woven carpet. Let us review Exhibit A, I announced, gesturing to the screen. This is an email sent from your personal device to my brother Harrison exactly 42 days ago. The subject line clearly reads liability structuring. I began reading the highlighted text aloud, projecting every single damning word to the silent audience. In this email, you explicitly instruct Harrison on how to bypass federal banking alerts while liquidating my grandfather's trust fund. You specifically advised him to break the stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars into smaller deposits under $10,000 each. That is a financial tactic known as structuring. It is a severe federal offense designed to evade the Internal Revenue Service and anti-money laundering protocols. You did not just look at fake books, Bradley. You wrote the instruction manual on how to launder stolen money. Stephanie let out a sharp, horrified wail. She stared at her husband, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She realized the man she had been boasting about was not a genius broker. He was a criminal mastermind who had deliberately engineered a federal trap. I clicked the remote again, bringing up a second email thread. Exhibit B. I continued, unrelenting. Here we have a detailed correspondence between you and Richard. You are actively advising him on how to create phantom revenue to trigger the $25 million buyout threshold. You detailed the exact process of registering the Delaware shell companies to hide the lack of actual medical supply exports. And most impressively, you negotiated a hidden 15% kickback fee for yourself. You demanded a massive cut of the stolen acquisition funds as payment for orchestrating this entire corporate illusion. The silence in the ballroom was absolute perfection. The local politicians and real estate developers were actively recording the presentation on their smartphones, capturing every single piece of undeniable evidence. They were documenting the total annihilation of Bradley's life. You were the architect of the tax evasion strategy, I declared, taking a slow, intimidating step toward him. You guided Richard into committing grand larceny. You forged your signature on those valuation documents because you genuinely believed my private equity firm was stupid enough to hand you a fortune without doing a basic background check. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. Bradley started to hyperventilate. His chest heaved as panic completely consumed his nervous system. He looked wildly around the room. He looked at Stephanie, who was now physically backing away from him in sheer terror. He looked at Richard, who was still kneeling on the floor, a broken, pathetic mess. He looked at the main mahogany doors, desperately calculating his chances of sprinting past the wall of elite security guards. Flight response had fully taken over his rational mind. He took a shaky, frantic step backward. He opened his mouth to scream a denial, to beg for mercy, or perhaps to just command his legs to run. But before a single sound could escape his lips, the heavy, oppressive silence of the estate was violently shattered. From the long, winding driveway outside the grand ballroom windows, The piercing, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens cut through the crisp autumn night. The harsh, rhythmic blaring grew exponentially louder, accompanied by the aggressive screech of heavy tires slamming onto the cobblestone entrance. Blue and red emergency lights began strobing violently against the historic stone facade of the mansion, casting frantic, flashing shadows across the terrified faces of my family. The heavy mahogany doors of the Grand Oak Manor did not simply swing open. They were forcefully breached by federal authority. A highly coordinated team of federal agents strode aggressively into the grand ballroom. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright, bold letters of the FBI and the SEC emblazoned across their backs. The sheer physical presence of federal law enforcement completely drained whatever remaining oxygen existed in the room. The local politicians and wealthy suburban socialites immediately pressed themselves against the silk wallpaper, desperate to avoid any accidental association with the incoming targets. The string quartet had long since fled, leaving their expensive instruments abandoned on the elevated stage. The lead investigator, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an expression of absolute stone, walked directly through the parted crowd. He bypassed the terrified guests and the frozen waitstaff, stopping squarely in front of my protective perimeter. Winston gave a crisp nod to his team, and the estate security guard smoothly stepped aside, allowing the federal agent to approach me. He looked at the massive projection screen still displaying the deeply incriminating email threads and forged financial documents. Then he looked directly at me. Madeline Caldwell, the lead agent, asked, his voice cutting sharply through the chaotic murmurs of the room. "I am the senior partner who transmitted the digital whistleblower dossier. I confirmed, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my tone strictly professional. The forensic audit is complete. The perpetrators are all present and currently contained within this room." The agent gave a single sharp nod of professional acknowledgement. He turned his imposing frame toward the three men who had spent their entire lives believing their arrogant entitlement placed them far above the law. Richard Caldwell. The agent barked, his voice booming with unmistakable legal authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and the falsification of commercial loan documents." My father was still kneeling on my custom-woven carpet. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated devastation. He did not attempt to run. He did not try to deny the charges anymore. His psychological collapse was absolute. Two federal agents moved in with terrifying efficiency. They hauled my father up by the armpits of his ruined custom tuxedo. Richard's legs could barely support his own weight. He looked around the room with wide, vacant eyes, silently pleading for anyone to intervene. But his wealthy country club friends just looked away entirely, refusing to meet his desperate gaze. The agents aggressively twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly across the vaulted ceiling. The sound was a definitive punctuation mark on the end of his fake empire. The lead agent did not pause to let the reality settle. He immediately turned his attention to my older brother, who was still pinned firmly to the hardwood floor by my private security team amid the shattered crystal champagne flutes. Harrison Caldwell. The agent continued reading from a digital warrant. "You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, forgery, and the illegal creation of fraudulent shell corporations." Winston signaled the estate guards to release their hold. The moment they stepped back, federal agents hauled Harrison roughly to his feet. My brother winced in physical pain, his expensive suit jacket torn and covered in sticky spilled alcohol. He looked absolutely pathetic. The golden boy of the family, the favored son who was supposed to inherit a massive legacy, was now being aggressively restrained and cuffed like a common street criminal. He kept his head down, too deeply ashamed to make eye contact with the Manhattan Investment Board, watching his profound humiliation. Bradley was the final target. My sister's husband had backed himself into a corner near a towering floral arrangement, trembling so violently he looked like he might physically shake apart. When the agents advanced toward him, he threw his hands up in the air, weeping openly in front of the entire high society crowd. "Please, you have to listen to me," Bradley sobbed loudly, thick tears streaming down his face, completely ruining his pristine image. I am just a basic insurance salesman. Richard manipulated me into signing those papers. They promised me a massive payout. I will give you everything on my private laptop. I will gladly testify against all of them in a federal court. Just please do not put me in handcuffs. I cannot go to a federal prison. The federal agents completely ignored his desperate, pathetic negotiating. They grabbed his wrists with zero hesitation and slammed the heavy steel cuffs onto his arms, pulling them tight. Stephanie let out a piercing, horrified scream, watching her supposedly brilliant, wealthy husband get dragged away weeping like a terrified child. Her grand illusion of suburban superiority was completely pulverized in an instant. The three arrogant men who had plotted to steal my inheritance and defraud a major New York firm were now lined up side by side, securely bound in federal restraints. The elite Manhattan executives watched the perp walk with cold, calculated satisfaction. The chairman of our board gave me a final respectful nod, validating my flawless execution, before turning and leading his team out of the venue back to their waiting convoy. Their departure broke the spell paralyzing the remaining guests. Absolute panic erupted among the local elite. Real estate developers, local politicians, and suburban socialites scrambled frantically toward the exits, desperate to flee the blast radius of the Caldwell family. They aggressively shoved past each other, abandoning expensive coats and half-eaten plates of imported caviar. I watched them pull out their smartphones, aggressively deleting photos, unfollowing social media accounts, and blocking my parents' contact numbers in real time. Nobody wanted to be tied to a highly publicized federal fraud investigation. They severed decades of fake friendships in a matter of seconds. Within minutes, the opulent birthday gala was entirely empty of guests. The grand ballroom, once a symbol of my family's ultimate social triumph, was now officially secured with bright yellow police tape, transforming instantly into an active, heavily guarded federal crime scene. The heavy mahogany doors closed firmly behind the federal agents, taking the last remnants of the Caldwell patriarchs with them. The grand ballroom of the Grand Oak Manor, once vibrating with the arrogant laughter of suburban elites, was now a cavernous hollow shell. Yellow police tape stretched across the main entrance to the administrative offices, transforming the site of my mother's 60th birthday gala into an active federal crime scene. The string quartet had fled in absolute panic, leaving overturned music stands and dropped sheets of classical arrangements scattered across the elevated stage. Half-empty champagne flutes sat abandoned on the high-top cocktail tables, their expensive bubbles going entirely flat in the deafening silence. In the exact center of the custom-woven carpet stood the only two people left from my toxic bloodline. My mother, Patricia, and my younger sister, Stephanie, looked absolutely pathetic. The $15,000 designer gown Stephanie had aggressively bragged about in her audio message now hung awkwardly on her trembling frame. Her expensive cosmetic application was completely ruined, tracing dark, jagged lines of running mascara down her pale cheeks. Patricia was in an even worse state. The woman who had spent the entire evening playing the role of a terrified, fragile victim was now genuinely experiencing pure, unadulterated terror. Her husband was in federal custody. Her favored son was facing years in prison. Her stolen wealth had evaporated into thin air right in front of her eyes. Patricia slowly lifted her head and looked at me. The arrogant matriarch who had stood on a rainy porch 16 years ago and watched me get thrown out of my childhood home was completely gone. In her place was a desperate, cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. She took a shaky, hesitant step forward, her expensive heels trembling uncontrollably on the polished marble floor. Then she let out a broken, sobbing wail and launched herself toward me. "Madeline, please!" Patricia cried out, her voice cracking with raw, humiliating desperation. She reached out with both of her shaking hands, attempting to grab my arms, attempting to force a maternal physical connection that had never actually existed between us. "You have to stop this right now. You have to call those federal agents and tell them it was all a massive misunderstanding. You have the power to fix this entire situation. We are your family. I am your mother. You cannot let them take your father and your brother away to a penitentiary." She fell to her knees right in front of me, sobbing loudly into the heavy silk fabric of my midnight blue gown. Stephanie stood frozen a few feet away, wrapping her arms tightly around her own stomach, completely unable to process the total destruction of her perfect suburban life and the arrest of her fraudulent husband. Madeline, please just listen to me, Patricia begged, looking up with wild, bloodshot eyes. I carried you for 9 months. I gave birth to you. We made terrible mistakes, yes, but we did it because we were terrified of losing our status. We just wanted to maintain our lifestyle. We just wanted to be respected in this community. You are so incredibly successful now. You do not even need that trust fund money. You have billions of dollars in real estate and private equity. Please just drop the lawsuit and the criminal charges. Tell the federal investigators you authorized the withdrawal from the account. You can save us all from ruin. A mother's love is unconditional, Madeline. Deep down, I know you still love us enough to forgive this. I looked down at the miserable woman weeping at my feet. For 34 years, I had secretly craved her approval. I had wanted nothing more than for her to look at me the way she looked at Harrison and Stephanie. But standing here now, watching her literally beg me to commit federal perjury just to save the men who had maliciously stolen my inheritance, I felt absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy for the Caldwell family was completely and permanently dry. I raised my arm and violently swatted her hands away from my dress. The physical rejection was sharp, undeniable, and filled with absolute disgust. Do not ever touch me again. I stated, my voice radiating a freezing, absolute calm that echoed fiercely through the empty ballroom. Do not dare speak to me about a mother's unconditional love. A real mother does not steal her daughter's financial safety net to buy premium table linens and imported caviar. A real mother does not stand by silently while her teenage daughter is thrown onto the street in the freezing rain to protect a drunk driver. You do not love me, Patricia. You only love the fact that I am the only person in this room with the power to keep you out of a federal prison cell. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. She scrambled backward on the carpet, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. You chose to fund this pathetic illusion with stolen money. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to cower further back. You chose to celebrate your fake wealth while deliberately banning me from the premises. You wanted to protect your high society image from the daughter you deemed a worthless failure. I looked from Patricia to Stephanie, ensuring they both heard every single syllable of my final verdict. I received a very specific text message from Richard earlier this week. I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, precise pitch. He told me not to bother showing up because my presence would be a disgrace. He told me to stay in my lane and leave the upper-class events to the people who actually belong there. I tilted my head, looking down at the two ruined women shivering helplessly on my property. Dad was completely right, I declared, throwing his exact toxic words straight back into their faces with devastating accuracy. This family does not welcome failures. You have failed as a mother. You have failed as a business. And you have failed to steal from me. The party is officially over. Pack your things and get off my property. Patricia let out a devastated, harrowing scream. She buried her face in her hands, realizing that no amount of tears or maternal manipulation would save her from the catastrophic consequences of her own blinding greed. Stephanie finally moved, rushing forward to pull our mother off the floor, but her own legs were shaking so violently she could barely support Patricia's dead weight. Winston! I called out, keeping my eyes locked on the pathetic display in front of me. The estate manager immediately stepped forward from the shadows, his white gloves pristine, his posture immaculate. Yes, senior partner, Winston replied, his voice crisp and professional. These two individuals are officially trespassing. I instructed, my voice devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. Escort them off the estate boundaries immediately. Do not allow them to collect any personal items from the coat room. Consider it done, Winston said, giving a sharp, authoritative nod to the wall of security guards. The massive ex-military personnel moved in perfect unison. They did not offer a gentle guiding hand. They aggressively grabbed Patricia and Stephanie by the upper arms, hauling them violently toward the grand mahogany doors. My mother kicked and screamed, sobbing my name over and over again, while my sister wept in absolute silent terror. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, severing my ties to my toxic bloodline forever. I walked to the towering glass windows and looked out over the sprawling cobblestone driveway. The luxury valets had completely vanished. The expensive sports cars and leased sedans belonging to the local elite were entirely gone. There were no drivers waiting. There were no taxis available. I stood perfectly still and watched Patricia and Stephanie dragging their ruined, expensive designer gowns across the cold, hard concrete. They were shivering uncontrollably in the crisp autumn night air, forced to walk the entire 2-mile stretch of the winding, unlit driveway in their high heels, completely abandoned in the dark with absolutely nowhere to go. 30 days is exactly how long it takes for a carefully constructed suburban dynasty to be completely pulverized by the federal justice system. 1 month after the raid at the Grand Oak Manor, the financial world woke up to a massive scandal plastered across the front page of every major business publication. The headlines were ruthless. Caldwell Medical Solutions was exposed not as a thriving healthcare supplier, but as a desperate criminal syndicate running a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. My private equity firm was praised for its rigorous due diligence, avoiding a catastrophic investment, while my father became the ultimate cautionary tale of corporate greed. The dismantling of the company was swift and absolute. A federal bankruptcy trustee was immediately appointed to liquidate Caldwell Medical Solutions. The sprawling manufacturing facility Richard used to brag about was locked down, and its aging equipment was auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to pay back furious commercial lenders. The empty warehouses were sold to logistics companies. The fake European distribution network was permanently erased from the Delaware corporate registry. Every single asset tied to the Caldwell name was seized, analyzed, and sold off to cover the massive mountain of debt they had hidden for 3 years. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse in Manhattan, watching the final sentencing hearings with cold professional satisfaction. There were no expensive defense attorneys standing beside my family members. Because I had successfully reclaimed my stolen trust fund, and the government had frozen all remaining assets connected to the fraud, Richard and Harrison were forced to rely on overworked public defenders. My father stood before the federal judge looking completely unrecognizable. The arrogant titan of industry was gone. Richard wore an orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His silver hair was unkempt, and his hands shook violently as the judge read the final verdict. For orchestrating federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and the falsification of commercial loan documents, Richard received a devastating sentence of 22 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly noted his abhorrent attempt to steal his own daughter's inheritance to fund a lavish lifestyle, calling it a display of unparalleled narcissistic greed. Richard did not look back at the gallery as the marshals led him away. His spirit was entirely broken. Harrison followed his father to the execution block. My older brother sobbed openly at the defense table, begging the judge for leniency and claiming he was manipulated by Richard. The judge was completely unmoved, pointing out that Harrison had personally created the shell corporations and actively attempted to extort me for financial gain. Harrison was handed a 15-year sentence for corporate embezzlement and federal extortion. The golden boy, who had never faced a single consequence in his entire pampered life, was now officially a federal inmate. Bradley faced his own unique brand of total annihilation. My sister's husband had spent the last 30 days frantically trying to cut a plea deal offering to testify against Richard and Harrison in exchange for immunity. The federal prosecutors laughed at his offer. They already had my pristine forensic dossier containing every single email Bradley had written, instructing the family on how to launder stolen money. The regulatory agencies acted with immediate lethal force. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority and the State Insurance Board permanently revoked every single license Bradley held. He was banned from operating in any financial capacity for the rest of his natural life. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison for his role in the money laundering conspiracy. Stephanie watched from the gallery, weeping hysterically as her husband was handcuffed and hauled out of the courtroom, leaving her completely destitute and entirely alone. With the men locked away in federal facilities, the catastrophic financial fallout immediately crashed down on the two women left behind. Patricia and Stephanie had spent their entire lives relying on the fraudulent wealth generated by others. Now they had absolutely nothing to shield them from the aggressive reality of commercial debt collection. The banks moved in with terrifying speed. Because Richard had used the family estate as collateral for his high-interest commercial loans, the foreclosure process was initiated immediately. I received updates from my legal team detailing the aggressive asset seizure. Repossession agents arrived at the pristine suburban mansion with heavy tow trucks. They did not knock politely. They hooked up Richard's prized vintage cars and Patricia's leased luxury SUVs, dragging them right out of the cobblestone driveway in broad daylight for the entire affluent neighborhood to witness. The country club officially revoked their membership, citing the federal indictments and unpaid dues. The local socialites who used to attend Patricia's lavish dinner parties completely ostracized them, blocking their numbers and crossing the street to avoid being seen with the disgraced family. Patricia and Stephanie were given a strict federal eviction notice. They had exactly 48 hours to vacate the sprawling suburban mansion before the bank chained the doors shut. They were not allowed to take the expensive artwork, the imported furniture, or the valuable jewelry, since all of it had been purchased using stolen corporate funds. They were permitted to pack only their basic clothing and essential personal items into a few cheap cardboard boxes. The woman who had bragged about her $15,000 designer gown and the matriarch who had stolen my inheritance to buy premium caviar were forced to cram their pathetic remaining belongings into the back of a cheap rental car. Having exhausted every single favor and burned every bridge in their wealthy community, they had absolutely nowhere left to go. With zero income, a massive mountain of legal debt, and a publicly destroyed reputation, Patricia and Stephanie were forced to sign a lease for a cramped, decaying two-bedroom apartment in a notoriously dangerous high-crime neighborhood on the very outskirts of the city. The crisp morning wind whipping off the Hudson River carried the distinct electric energy of Manhattan. I stepped out of my chauffeured black car, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The towering glass and steel facade of my private equity firm headquarters reflected the bright morning sun. It was a Tuesday, exactly 5 weeks after the federal raid at my estate, and my schedule was packed with aggressive corporate acquisitions. I adjusted my tailored wool coat, preparing to walk through the revolving glass doors and dominate another financial quarter. Before my leather heels could strike the pristine pavement leading to the private executive entrance, two frantic figures lunged out from the shadows of a nearby concrete security bollard. "Madeline, please wait." The desperate screeching voice was instantly recognizable, but the physical appearance of the woman screaming my name was entirely foreign. I stopped completely still, motioning for my personal security detail to hold their ground for just a moment. I wanted to see exactly what complete financial annihilation looked like up close. Patricia and Stephanie scrambled across the wide sidewalk, desperately trying to intercept me before I entered the fortress of the corporate lobby. The transformation they had undergone in just 30 days was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, polished suburban socialites who had mocked my existence were entirely gone. My mother looked deeply hollowed out. Her once perfectly maintained hair showed stark, jagged lines of stark gray at the roots. She was wearing a cheap synthetic winter coat that hung awkwardly on her shrinking frame. The expensive designer handbags she used to flaunt had been replaced by a frayed canvas tote bag. Stephanie looked even worse. The golden child who had proudly bragged about her custom gown was now shivering in a faded, oversized sweater, her face completely devoid of makeup, her eyes dark and sunken from weeks of relentless stress and sleepless nights in their dangerous new neighborhood. They looked exactly like the desperate failures they had spent their entire lives mocking. "Madeline, thank God we caught you," Patricia gasped out, clutching her chest as she stopped a few feet away from me. She tried to reach out and grab my arm, but my lead security guard immediately stepped forward, blocking her physical access with a massive, intimidating frame. Patricia recoiled, wrapping her arms around herself. She immediately launched into her signature manipulation tactic, attempting to weaponize maternal guilt. You have to help us, she sobbed loudly, her voice cracking with raw, humiliating panic. The new apartment is a living nightmare, Madeline. There are sirens every single night. The heating barely works. We do not have any money for groceries. You have to give us a monthly allowance, just a basic stipend so we can move to a safe neighborhood. We have absolutely nothing left. Stephanie stepped up beside our mother, nodding frantically. Her previous arrogance had been entirely pulverized by the harsh reality of systemic poverty. Please, Madeline. Stephanie begged, her voice a high-pitched, pathetic whine. Bradley ruined my life. Richard forced us into this situation. We did not know anything about the fake European invoices or the federal wire fraud. Dad controlled all the bank accounts. We were just innocent bystanders. He manipulated us just like he manipulated you. You cannot let your own flesh and blood freeze in a slum while you sit on billions of dollars. I stood perfectly still, letting their pathetic excuses hang in the freezing morning air. A few passing Wall Street executives glanced over, but kept walking, entirely uninterested in the frantic begging of two disheveled women. I did not feel a single drop of anger. I did not feel the familiar burning resentment that used to consume me when I was a vulnerable teenager seeking their approval. Looking at the two women shivering on the concrete, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional void inside my chest was completely liberating. You are not innocent bystanders, I stated, my voice radiating a chilling absolute calm that made them both flinch. You were active, enthusiastic participants in my destruction. You gladly wore the diamonds and drank the imported champagne funded by my stolen inheritance. You stood in the center of my estate and tried to have me thrown out by security so you could continue playing pretend billionaires. You only hate Richard now because he got caught and lost the credit cards. Patricia let out a loud, devastated wail, attempting to drop to her knees right there on the Manhattan sidewalk. I did not let her finish the theatrical performance. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored wool coat. My fingers brushed against a crisp piece of paper I had kept specifically for this exact inevitable encounter. I pulled my hand out and extended my arm directly toward my shivering younger sister. Held perfectly between my index and middle finger was a single crisp $100 bill. It was the exact same piece of currency Bradley had violently thrown at my feet in the middle of the grand ballroom. I had instructed Winston to retrieve it from the carpet and sanitize it just for this occasion. Stephanie stared at the green paper, her eyes widening in profound, humiliated recognition. She remembered exactly what this money represented. Take that and call a cab back to whatever miserable slum you currently live in, I commanded, throwing the exact toxic insult her husband had used straight back into her face with devastating, lethal accuracy. Buy yourselves a cheap dinner and try to forget you ever saw how the actual financial elite live. Do not dirty the sidewalk of my corporate headquarters with your desperate poverty. I flicked my wrist and dropped the $100 bill directly onto the cold concrete right at Stephanie's worn-out shoes. My sister let out a choked, humiliated sob. She squeezed her eyes shut, entirely broken by the sheer poetic cruelty of the gesture. She slowly bent down, trembling violently, and picked up the cash from the dirty pavement because she was genuinely too impoverished to leave it behind. Patricia stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the daughter she had thrown away was now a completely untouchable force of nature. I turned my back on them, addressing the heavily armed head of building security standing by the revolving glass doors. These two women are officially classified as a corporate security threat, I instructed, my voice carrying absolute finality. Add their faces to the biometric facial recognition database. They are permanently banned from entering this building or stepping foot on any property managed by my firm. If they ever approach this perimeter again, you have my direct authorization to have them immediately arrested for criminal trespassing and targeted harassment. Understood, senior partner, the security chief replied, giving a sharp professional nod. I did not look back. I stepped through the heavy revolving glass doors, leaving Patricia and Stephanie standing on the freezing sidewalk, clutching a single $100 bill, entirely banished from my world forever. The private elevator ascended smoothly to the top floor of the financial tower, carrying me away from the freezing street level and the miserable ghosts of my past. The polished steel doors glided open with a quiet, soft chime. I stepped onto the thick carpet of the executive suite, breathing in the faint scent of expensive leather and fresh espresso. My assistant offered a polite professional nod as I walked past the reception desk and entered my corner office. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, sealing the room in absolute silence. I walked directly to the floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around my workspace. The morning sun was fully rising now, casting a brilliant golden light across the vast, sprawling skyline of Manhattan. The city stretched out below me, a labyrinth of concrete glass and endless ambition. Millions of people were rushing through the streets fighting for their piece of the world, but standing up here looking down at the empire I had conquered, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of stillness. I moved to my desk and tapped the keyboard of my secure workstation. The monitor flickered to life, displaying a single encrypted message from my lead financial attorney. The subject line read, "Final asset recovery and restitution transfer complete." I opened the attached banking ledger. The numbers printed on the screen were absolutely flawless. The federal bankruptcy trustee managing the liquidation of Caldwell Medical Solutions had executed the final court-ordered transfer. Every single dollar my parents had stolen from my grandfather's irrevocable trust fund had been forcefully extracted from their seized assets and returned to my private accounts. But it was not just the principal amount. The federal judge had awarded massive punitive damages and years of compounded interest, completely draining whatever hidden reserves Richard and Patricia had tried to conceal. The balance sitting in my account was now a staggering, undeniable fortune. I did not smile. I did not cheer or celebrate. I simply reached out and closed the laptop, letting the screen fade to black. The war was officially over. The financial battlefield was completely cleared of enemy combatants. For 16 years, the memory of that freezing, rainy night on the driveway had haunted my quiet moments. The terrified 18-year-old girl who had been thrown away like garbage used to whisper in the back of my mind, asking why she was not good enough for her own parents to love. I had spent over a decade building my career, acquiring immense wealth, and destroying corporate predators, all to prove that I was not the failure they claimed I was. But looking out over the New York skyline, I realized that the terrified girl in the rain was finally gone. The encounter on the sidewalk with my mother and sister had completely erased her. Seeing Patricia and Stephanie shivering in their cheap coats begging for a handout had extinguished the very last ember of my resentment. I did not hate them anymore. I did not wish them any further harm. I simply did not care about their existence. They were utterly irrelevant to my reality. The emotional void I felt regarding the Caldwell family was not a sign of coldness. It was the pure, unadulterated sensation of absolute freedom. Society spends a massive amount of time pushing a highly toxic narrative about family loyalty. We are constantly conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a genetic sequence with our abusers. We are pressured to keep a seat at the table for people who do nothing but poison the meal. That is a dangerous, manipulative lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. Blood does not make a family. Blood is nothing more than a random biological accident. Loyalty, unwavering support, and mutual respect are the only materials strong enough to build a real family. When you discover that a part of your body is infected with a malignant tumor, you do not negotiate with the disease. You do not try to reason with the cancer. You instruct a surgeon to cut the tumor out completely and throw it in the incinerator so the rest of your body can survive and thrive. Toxic relatives are exactly the same. They are malignant tumors feeding off your energy, your success, and your peace of mind. You must have the absolute courage to cut them off permanently. People often misunderstand the concept of revenge. They think revenge requires screaming matches, physical violence, or dedicating your life to destroying someone else. But true high-level revenge is much cleaner and far more devastating. The ultimate revenge is simply walking away and allowing the truth to do the heavy lifting for you. You do not need to ruin them. You just need to hand them the rope of their own boundless greed, shine a bright spotlight on their actions, and let the relentless machinery of the law pull the lever. While they spend the rest of their miserable lives suffocating under the crushing weight of their own consequences, you get to focus entirely on your own elevation. You get to sleep peacefully in luxurious beds. You get to build businesses, command respect, and surround yourself with people who genuinely value your presence. You get to stand at the top of the world completely untouchable, enjoying the spectacular view. My name is Madeline, and I am entirely free. I survived the betrayal, I dismantled the fraud, and I reclaimed everything that was rightfully mine. I chose my own independence over a toxic bloodline, and it was the greatest financial and emotional investment I have ever made. If you are watching this and you are currently suffocating under the weight of a family that constantly belittles, exploits, or manipulates you, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your abusers your future. You have the power to walk out the door and never look back. Do not wait for an apology that will never come. Gather your strength, secure your resources, and build an empire so incredibly vast that their toxic shadows can never touch you again. Have you ever had to find the courage to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Have you ever watched karma finally catch up to the people who tried to destroy you? Share your survival stories in the comments below. Let your truth be the catalyst for someone else's freedom. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience and ultimate justice. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Always remember that your independence is your greatest weapon. Use it wisely. The most profound lesson we can extract from this journey is that the concept of unconditional familial loyalty is often a toxic trap designed to keep you tethered to your abusers. Society constantly bombards us with the narrative that blood is thicker than water, and that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our genetics. However, true family is never defined by a biological accident. It is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and absolute trust. When relatives view you not as a person, but as a financial resource or an emotional punching bag, you have zero obligation to keep a seat for them at your table. Furthermore, this story teaches us the immense, undeniable power of financial and emotional independence. The ultimate revenge against narcissistic, toxic family members does not require screaming matches, public meltdowns, or stooping to their level of cruelty. True high-level justice is achieved through cold, calculated boundaries and strict adherence to reality. By securing your own resources, documenting every betrayal, and refusing to engage in their delusional drama, you strip them of their power. You do not need to actively destroy people who are already constructing their own downfall, fueled by their insatiable greed and arrogance. You simply need to step aside, shine a brilliant spotlight on their actions, and let the relentless machinery of consequences run its natural course. Your worth is never determined by the people who failed to appreciate you. Walking away from a toxic bloodline is not a failure. It is the ultimate victory of self-preservation. You have the absolute right to curate your environment and surround yourself only with individuals who elevate your peace of mind. Have you ever found the courage to establish unbreakable boundaries with toxic relatives to protect your own future? Share your story of survival in the comments below, and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button to join our community of strong, independent individuals who refuse to settle for anything less than absolute respect.